It's 3:47 in the morning. The death hour, they call it in hospitals, when the human body is at its weakest, when most people slip away quietly into the darkness. But on the 4th floor of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, death wasn't just visiting the critically ill, it was being delivered by someone patients trusted with their lives. 9 patients died on his watch in just 6 months. 9 families received that devastating phone call in the middle of the night. 9 lives cut short, not by disease or age, but by a predator wearing scrubs. But they weren't supposed to die, and he knew it. What I'm about to show you will make you question every healthcare worker you've ever trusted. Because this isn't just about one sick individual. This is about a system that failed so catastrophically that a wolf was allowed to hunt freely among the most vulnerable members of our society. Before we dive into this nightmare that actually happened, I need you to hit subscribe, because what healthcare executives don't want you to know about this case could save your life or someone you love. Trust me, you'll want to remember this channel after what you're about to learn. Have you ever felt uneasy around a healthcare worker? Drop your experiences below, because after you hear this story, you'll understand why those gut feelings matter more than you ever imagined. Michael Taylor. On paper, he was everything a hospital could want in a night shift nurse. Perfect attendance record, glowing patient reviews, colleagues respected him, supervisors praised his dedication. He was the kind of nurse who stayed late to comfort families, said Dr. Sarah Jones, who worked alongside Taylor for 2 years. He'd bring coffee to grieving relatives. He remembered patient names weeks after they'd been discharged. But perfection in healthcare isn't always what it seems. Taylor had been working at St. Catherine's for 3 years when the killing spree began. He specifically requested the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., claiming he preferred the quieter pace and closer patient relationships. What nobody realized was that he preferred the darkness for entirely different reasons. The night shift meant fewer supervisors, fewer witnesses, fewer questions when things went wrong. During his performance reviews, Taylor consistently scored in the top 5% of nursing staff. His patient satisfaction surveys were nearly perfect. Families would specifically mention him in their thank you letters to the hospital. "He held my mother's hand during her final moments," wrote one family member in a letter that was proudly displayed on the unit bulletin board. His compassion made an impossible situation bearable. That letter was dated just 3 days after Taylor had deliberately ended that woman's life. But there were warning signs, subtle ones that everyone missed or ignored. Dr. James Mark, the night shift supervisor, later admitted he'd noticed Taylor's unusual interest in patient charts. He'd study files for patients who weren't even his assignment, Mark recalled. When I asked why, he said he liked to stay informed about everyone on the floor. I thought it showed initiative. What Taylor was actually doing was hunting, studying, planning. Nurse Jennifer Walsh worked the same shift rotation as Taylor for 8 months. She remembered his odd comments about certain patients. He'd say things like, "Mrs. Thompson would be better off if she just let go," or "Mr. Davidson is suffering for no reason." At the time, I thought he was just being philosophical about end-of-life care. Should patients have access to their healthcare workers' backgrounds? Let me know what you think, because what you're about to learn might change your mind about hospital transparency. The psychological profile that emerged later painted a picture of someone who saw himself as a mercy killer, a decision-maker who could determine who deserved to live and who should die. But his victim selection told a different, more disturbing story. Taylor wasn't ending suffering. He was feeding a God complex that had been growing for years. The hospital administration had received 3 separate complaints about Taylor in the months leading up to his arrest. 3 families had specifically requested that he not be assigned to their loved one's care. The hospital did nothing. "We couldn't take action based on personality conflicts," explained hospital administrator Patricia Kim during the subsequent investigation. He hadn't violated any protocols. His medical care was exemplary. Have you ever had a gut feeling about someone that turned out to be right? Share your story below, because the families who complained about Taylor wish they'd pushed harder. The night shift supervisor later said she always felt something was off about how Taylor interacted with certain patients, but here's why she never reported it. She thought she was being paranoid. "He was so professional, so competent," she explained. "I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that I was being unfair to someone who was clearly dedicated to his job." Patient families started noticing patterns too. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, whose husband was Taylor's third victim, later told investigators she felt uncomfortable with how much time Taylor spent in her husband's room. "He'd come in, even when he wasn't assigned to my husband's care," she remembered. "He'd ask detailed questions about my husband's medical history, his family situation. At the time, I thought he was just being thorough. But when families complained about feeling uneasy, guess what happened? They were told they were emotional, that they were looking for someone to blame for their loved one's condition." The hospital's patient advocate dismissed multiple concerns about Taylor as grief displacement, families looking for someone to blame for their loved one's deteriorating condition. And then they found the notebook. What was inside will haunt you. The discovery came during a routine locker inspection after Taylor called in sick for 3 consecutive shifts, something that had never happened in his entire 3-year employment history. His supervisor, following protocol, needed to retrieve some patient files from his locker. What she found instead was a composition notebook filled with meticulous handwriting. The notebook contained detailed profiles of 23 patients, names, room numbers, medical conditions, family situations, visiting schedules. But this wasn't medical record keeping. This was something far more sinister. Each entry included what investigators later called vulnerability assessments. Taylor had systematically catalogued which patients had regular visitors, which ones complained about their care, which families asked too many questions. If this is making your blood boil like mine is, smash that subscribe button and share this video, because every single person needs to know how easily this happened and how to protect themselves. The healthcare industry is not talking about this case, and that should terrify you. Room 412, Gerald Morrison, 67, pneumonia recovery. Entry read, daughter visits daily 2 to 4 p.m., sons visit weekends. Family asks many questions about medications. High risk. Wait for opportunity. Morrison survived his hospital stay. Room 408, Betty Connors, no relation, 73, post-surgical recovery. Entry read, no family visits after day 3, complains about night shift noise, expressed frustration with slow recovery, low risk, window, Tuesday night. Betty Connors died on a Tuesday night at 3:52 a.m. The notebook revealed a chilling pattern. Taylor's list included patients who complained about him. That's right, he targeted people for speaking up about their discomfort with his care. Mrs. Dorothy Reeves had told her daughter she didn't like how Taylor looked at her. The daughter mentioned it to a day nurse, who noted it in the patient file. Taylor had access to that file. Mrs. Reeves died 4 days later. Some victims were elderly with no visitors. He knew nobody would ask questions immediately. Others were patients with complicated family situations, where relatives might not immediately notice changes in condition. The most disturbing part. He kept detailed notes on their final moments. Fine subject became agitated at 3:45 a.m., read one entry. Called for help at 3:47 a.m., respiratory distress began 3:50 a.m., code called 3:53 a.m., pronounced 4:17 a.m., family arrival 6:30 a.m., emotional response appropriate. Would you visit a family member alone in the hospital after hearing this? Because Taylor specifically targeted patients who were isolated, who wouldn't have advocates present during vulnerable night hours. The notebook also revealed his twisted justification system. Patients were categorized as mercies, those he believed would be better off dead, and problems, those who questioned his authority or made complaints about his care. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold. The notebook contained 14 additional names with detailed assessments, 14 more potential victims who were saved only because Taylor's sick leave triggered the locker search. Should patient room assignments be randomized to prevent targeting? Share your thoughts, because Taylor's systematic approach to victim selection shows just how vulnerable patients really are. The entries showed a disturbing escalation. Early victims were described in clinical, detached language, but as time went on, the entries became more personal, more emotional. Taylor was getting more satisfaction from each death. His final entry, written the night before he called in sick, was the most chilling of all. Power over life and death is intoxicating. These people trust me completely. They have no idea I could end their suffering with a simple decision. The families thank me for my compassion. If they only knew the mercy I've shown their loved ones. When confronted with the notebook during his arrest, Taylor showed no remorse. Instead, he was angry that his research had been invaded. "You don't understand," he told detectives. "I was documenting my observations. I was trying to understand human nature at its most vulnerable point." But investigators understood exactly what they were looking at: a predator's hunting journal, meticulously maintained by someone who saw patients not as human beings, but as subjects in his twisted experiments with power. The timeline that emerged from the investigation was terrifying in its precision. 9 patients over 6 months, always during night shifts when Taylor worked alone with minimal supervision. The hospital's own security footage shows him entering victim rooms just minutes before their unexpected declines. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. He had legitimate reasons to be in every single room. As a night shift nurse, Taylor had access to any patient on the floor, if their condition changed or if their assigned nurse needed assistance. He used this access to select, study, and ultimately target his victims without raising suspicion. His method was almost undetectable because it relied on his extensive medical knowledge and his understanding of how hospitals operate during overnight hours. Patient monitoring systems would show gradual declines that appeared natural. Emergency response protocols were followed perfectly. Taylor himself often led the resuscitation efforts for his own victims. He was always the first to respond when a patient coded, remembered Dr. Jones. He'd work harder than anyone to try to save them. The irony makes me physically sick. Family members were told their loved ones took a turn for the worse. Lies, all lies. Taylor would console grieving families, offering them coffee and tissues while expressing his own sadness about their loss. "He seemed genuinely upset when my father died," said Matthew Patterson, whose 69-year-old father was Taylor's 6th victim. "He told me that he'd grown fond of Dad during his stay, that Dad had talked about his grandchildren and his garden. Looking back, it makes my skin crawl." The worst part? 3 families specifically requested he not treat their relatives after feeling uncomfortable with his bedside manner. The hospital ignored every single request. "We can't accommodate every family preference," explained nursing supervisor Karen Walsh during the investigation. "If we honored every request to avoid specific staff members, we couldn't function." How would you feel if this happened to your family member? Because these 3 families had to watch their loved ones die at the hands of someone they'd specifically tried to protect them from. Taylor manipulated medical records with surgical precision. He understood exactly which medications and interventions would appear routine to investigators. He knew how to create medical emergencies that would look like natural complications. Even more chilling, he participated in the debriefing sessions after each patient death, meetings where staff analyzed what went wrong and how similar incidents could be prevented in the future. He was always very engaged in these discussions, Dr. Mark recalled. He'd ask thoughtful questions about the patient's condition, suggest improvements to our protocols. He was helping us investigate deaths that he had caused. The psychological profile developed by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Michael Thompson revealed a classic narcissistic personality with sociopathic tendencies. Taylor saw patients as objects in his personal experiment, Dr. Thompson explained. He was studying human reactions to mortality, both from the dying patients and from their families. He positioned himself as a researcher rather than a murderer. Should families have the right to reject specific healthcare workers? Because if the hospital had honored those 3 families' requests, 6 people would still be alive today. But Taylor's arrogance ultimately led to his downfall. His confidence in his methods made him sloppy about covering his digital tracks. Hospital computer systems logged every access to patient files, every medication order, every chart update. When investigators finally connected the dots, they found Taylor had accessed records for patients who weren't his assigned responsibility in the hours before their deaths. He had also made subtle changes to medication orders that wouldn't be noticed during routine care, but would be significant during a forensic review. The evidence was overwhelming. Taylor had the access, the knowledge, the opportunity, and the documented intent to kill these patients. Yet he almost got away with it. The first crack in Taylor's perfect facade came from an unlikely source. Mrs. Helen Santos, a 74-year-old retired schoolteacher whose son Miguel worked as a pharmacy technician. Miguel had noticed unusual medication patterns while reviewing drug usage reports for inventory purposes. The night shift was ordering significantly more emergency cardiac medications than the day or evening shifts. At first, I thought maybe the sicker patients were assigned to nights, Miguel explained. But when I looked at the admission diagnoses, it didn't make sense. We were using more emergency drugs on patients who should have been stable. Miguel mentioned his observations to his mother, who had just completed her own 3-day stay at St. Catherine's. Mrs. Santos remembered feeling uneasy about her night nurse, a young man who asked too many personal questions and seemed overly interested in her family situation. "Something about him made my skin crawl," she told her son. "He wanted to know if I lived alone, how often my children visited, whether anyone would miss me if I disappeared. At the time, I thought I was being paranoid." But Mrs. Santos wasn't paranoid, she was perceptive, and when her son shared his medication concerns, she insisted they contact the hospital administration. "If you want justice for these 9 victims and their families, the least you can do is hit subscribe and share this everywhere. These families deserve to have their story heard, and you sharing this video might prevent this from happening to someone else. Don't scroll past their pain, take 2 seconds and subscribe." The hospital's initial response was predictably bureaucratic. Patient Safety Coordinator Janet Mills listened politely to the Santos family's concerns and promised to look into the matter. But here's what actually happened. Mills filed a standard incident report and forgot about it. The report sat in a filing cabinet for 3 weeks. It was only when Mrs. Santos called back, angry that she hadn't heard anything, that Mills actually pulled Taylor's employment file and began cross-referencing the medication discrepancies with patient outcomes. What she found made her blood run cold. 9 unexpected deaths on Taylor's shifts in 6 months, all during the early morning hours, all involving patients who had been stable or improving. Mills immediately contacted Dr. Patricia Sanchez, the hospital's chief medical officer, who ordered a comprehensive review of all deaths during Taylor's shifts. The forensic audit took 2 weeks and involved external investigators, toxicologists, and medical examiners. What they uncovered was a systematic pattern of patient deaths that could not be explained by natural causes. But Taylor had already suspected the investigation was coming. Hospital security footage later showed him accessing patient files and medication records during his shifts in the weeks before his arrest. He was reviewing his own handiwork, possibly preparing his defense or identifying potential evidence that needed to be destroyed. When investigators finally confronted Taylor, he showed no surprise, no denial, no emotional response. He simply asked for an attorney and refused to answer questions. The search of his home revealed additional notebooks, detailed floor plans of the hospital, and disturbing research materials about poisons, cardiac medications, and methods of inducing respiratory failure. His computer contained bookmarks for websites about famous hospital killers, forensic science, and criminal investigation techniques. Taylor had been studying how other healthcare serial killers were caught, trying to avoid their mistakes. The most chilling discovery was a detailed timeline Taylor had created, documenting each victim's death with timestamps, family reactions, and hospital responses. He had turned murder into a research project. During the preliminary hearing, families of the victims packed the courtroom. Many heard the full details of Taylor's crimes for the first time. "We trusted him," said Maria Santos, whose mother was Taylor's second victim. "We thanked him for taking such good care of her. We were grateful when he worked extra shifts to be with her. The betrayal is almost worse than the loss." Taylor showed no remorse during the proceedings. He sat calmly taking notes, occasionally nodding as if he were observing an interesting case study rather than facing judgment for his own crimes. The prosecutor, District Attorney Craig Pierce, called it the most disturbing case he'd encountered in 15 years of practice. "This defendant didn't kill in passion or anger or desperation," Kim told the jury. "He killed for entertainment. He killed to satisfy his curiosity about human mortality. He killed because he enjoyed playing God with other people's lives. What changes would you demand if this happened at your local hospital? Because the systemic failures that enabled Taylor's killing spree exist in healthcare facilities across the country. The trial lasted 4 weeks and included testimony from 23 witnesses, including surviving family members, hospital staff, and forensic experts. The evidence was overwhelming. Taylor's notebook, security footage, computer records, medication discrepancies, and forensic analysis of the victims all pointed to systematic, premeditated murder. But the most powerful testimony came from the families themselves. Matthew Patterson, whose father was Taylor's 6th victim, spoke directly to Taylor during his victim impact statement. "You comforted me when my father died. You told me he spoke about his grandchildren in his final hours. Now I know those were lies. You robbed us of his final words, his final moments, his final breath. You stole our goodbye." Taylor was convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, noting the systematic nature of the crimes and Taylor's complete lack of remorse, called it one of the most heinous betrayals of trust in modern medical history. But justice for the victims was only the beginning. The case exposed systemic vulnerabilities in hospital security, patient monitoring, and staff oversight that demanded immediate attention. St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital implemented sweeping reforms within weeks of Taylor's arrest. All patient deaths during night shifts now require immediate review by 2 independent physicians. No single staff member can access patient medications without electronic verification from a supervisor. Security cameras were installed in all patient rooms and medication storage areas. Most importantly, the hospital established a patient advocacy hotline that allows families to report concerns about specific staff members without going through hospital administration. If the Santos family had been able to report their concerns directly to an outside agency, this investigation would have started months earlier, explained Dr. Sanchez. How many lives could have been saved? The State Medical Board also implemented new requirements for healthcare facilities statewide: annual psychological evaluations for all patient care staff, random audits of medication usage patterns, mandatory reporting of patient complaints about specific healthcare workers. But the most significant change was cultural, not procedural. "We have to stop dismissing families' concerns as emotional overreactions," said Dr. Jones, who now works as a patient safety consultant. "When someone says they feel uncomfortable with a healthcare provider, we need to listen, we need to investigate, we need to take those gut feelings seriously." Have you experienced poor hospital care? Your story matters. Share it below, because patient advocacy starts with speaking up about concerning experiences. The Taylor case also sparked national conversations about healthcare worker screening and ongoing monitoring. Currently, hospitals conduct background checks at the time of hire, but rarely reassess employees' psychological fitness for patient care. Dr. Thompson, the forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Taylor, advocates for regular mental health screenings for all healthcare workers with direct patient access. "We require pilots to undergo regular psychological evaluations because we trust them with hundreds of lives," Dr. Thompson explained. "Healthcare workers have access to thousands of vulnerable patients over their careers. Why wouldn't we apply the same standards?" But implementation remains inconsistent across the country. Budget constraints, staffing shortages, and resistance from healthcare worker unions have slowed adoption of comprehensive screening programs. Some facilities have implemented peer reporting systems where staff members can confidentially report concerns about colleagues' behavior or patient interactions. Others have invested in advanced monitoring systems that track medication usage, patient outcomes, and staff access patterns to identify potential problems before they become tragedies. The technology exists to prevent cases like Taylor's. Electronic systems can flag unusual patterns immediately, supervisory algorithms can identify high-risk situations, and automated alerts can ensure that concerning incidents receive immediate attention. But technology is only as effective as the people implementing it. The Taylor case succeeded because multiple people noticed problems, but failed to connect the dots or take decisive action. Mrs. Santos's instincts were correct. Miguel Santos's observations were accurate. The three families who requested different nursing assignments were protecting their loved ones from a killer. The system failed them all. Share this with someone who works in healthcare. They need to see this case and understand how critical their role is in patient safety. Healthcare workers are the first line of defense against predators like Taylor. Every healthcare professional has a moral obligation to report concerns about colleagues' behavior, even when those concerns are based on intuition rather than concrete evidence. Every hospital administrator has a responsibility to investigate patient complaints thoroughly, even when they seem minor or emotionally motivated. Every family member has the right to advocate for their loved one's safety, even when it means being uncomfortable or demanding answers from medical professionals. The 9 victims of Michael Taylor trusted a system that failed them catastrophically. Their deaths were preventable. Their killer was stoppable. Their families deserved better. But their tragedy can become other families' protection if we learn from the systemic failures that enabled a predator to hunt freely among the most vulnerable members of our society. What changes would you demand if this happened at your local hospital? Share your thoughts below, because patient safety depends on all of us staying vigilant, asking questions, and refusing to accept that healthcare institutions are beyond accountability. The wolf in scrubs is gone, but the hunting grounds remain. It's up to all of us to make sure they're never safe for predators again.